All right, well, I will commence because I'm just not patient. Well, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I know that we will have attendees from many parts of the world across the 4 continents. Haven't quite figured out how to get the 5th continent yet, Antarctica, but we'll work on that. The Education with Values Summit is an important forum, and a number of these events have been held over the past year and a half to address issues that exist across each of the continents, not just in the Western Hemisphere. We've had contributors who are scholars, practitioners, principals of schools, theoreticians, and in all of our discussions, we have had very interesting Q&A sessions, but we've also been extremely privileged that as we wrap up these series, there will be a compendium or booklet produced which captures the reports provided, perhaps updated from the speakers as well, to enable the subsequent activities of then trying to engage and seek change in this particular area. So for today's event, Educating with Values Summit, why educating with values is important and what should this look like in 2022 and beyond. We are very privileged to have 4 outstanding speakers discussing this area, values in global education for developing young international citizens. Mrs. Jenny Rickard, Dr. Suzanne Kremen, Mrs. Ilan Sabri. Ahmed will discuss an exercise in parental self-reflection on values to enhance career guidance for children. And our first speaker, Dr. Joy DeLeo, will discuss values in global education for, as we said, developing young international citizens. Prior to commencing, I'd like to also acknowledge and thank the contribution, as always, by our conference organisers, the Universal Peace Federation, the International Association of Academicians for Peace, and strategic partner Women's Federation for World Peace, supporting organisations, the Centre for Global Non-Killing, the Australian Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Global Opportunities Commercialisation Group, the Global Somali Diaspora, and last but not least, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, Asia Pacific Network for International Education and Values Education. To introduce our first speaker, our dear friend, Dr. Joy DeLeo. She's the holder of the UPF Peace Ambassador, President of UPF South Australia chapter, member International Association of Academicians for Peace, founding President of UNESCO and APNIVE Australia. Joy has worked in education for over 40 years in both public and private sectors, involved in policy, curriculum, research, management and teaching with Indigenous and migrant communities, international students, and teacher educators across the Asia Pacific region. Former member of the Australian National Commission for UNESCO, Joy has conducted and promoted teacher education programs in values-based education in Australia and internationally for over 2 decades. Dr. DeLeo, floor is yours. I think you're on mute. Okay, here we go.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. It's wonderful to be here as always. I've just shared my screen. So are you able to see that now?
Perfectly well, thank you. Yep.
Oh, good. Excellent. I'll just start from the beginning of my presentation. Okay. I'm going to talk about values in global education and the importance of developing not only local citizens, but international or global citizens as well. I'm going to talk about the learning journey generally, and how to integrate global education in that and where it fits, and then talk about what is global education and global citizenship, where these originated and how it's reflected in the curriculum, and certainly why global education is important, and how they're underpinned by universal or global values. And then briefly talk about where these global values come from and how schools foster global education, but most importantly also the role of parents and families in global education, which I think is very appropriate given that we have the Australian Parents Council with us today. So it's generally considered good practice to begin with young children, starting from themselves so that education is relevant to them and familiar, so that they learn about themselves, their family, their friends, their school, neighbourhood, and where they live, their country, and then eventually their world and their universe. So with global education, we'd like to go beyond the what, if you like, of knowledge, which can be considered separate. We'd like to take a holistic approach and not just consider what, when, and where, but also the how and the why, because values are about why. The values by which we live together peacefully and harmoniously, the values relating to caring for our world together and its resources, how we celebrate our similarities and differences and value diversity, and how children see themselves as part of nature and not separate from it, because we depend upon nature to survive. And in particular, to recognise their connectedness and interdependence with all life and with people all over the world, and with children their own age all over the world, to see themselves as part of that family of humanity beyond their immediate family, and values such as compassion and caring for others who are less fortunate than themselves. So this learning spiral, again, starts from the learner themselves, but is filled out to see themselves in the context of a world in which there are other children just like themselves, looking at and learning about families around the world and friends across the world, schools around the world, how they're similar, how they're different, looking at diverse cultural communities, learning about their own place and the place of others in the world, and then extending that to caring for nature and connecting with children and comparing similarities and differences, because children learn very powerfully through comparison and understanding difference, but also recognizing that connection through similarity. So it's about linking local perspectives in their own place with global perspectives as well, so that they recognize themselves as an individual, but also connected to family, community, and others around the world as a member of their local society, but also member of global societies as well as a global citizen. So these kinds of things have in fact been embedded in global education since about the 60s, but it's expanded and grown, so I'll talk about that. And it's reflected in progressive national statements on education, which changes about every 10 years. And the current national statement on education is about promoting excellence and equity, but also about enabling learners to become informed citizens. And even though the National Declaration doesn't specify whether we're talking about national citizens or global citizens, it just leaves it generally as citizens. So I think it's appropriate to strengthen global education at this time, because we recognise our connectedness, and I think climate change in particular has highlighted the fact that no matter where we are in the world, we're not protected from what happens in other parts of the world, and particularly we've seen that with the war in the Ukraine, that it's affecting people all over the world in terms of food supplies and supplies of resources generally. So what is global education? Education about global issues intends to promote knowledge, skills, and values for global citizenship. It certainly promotes open-mindedness, but also promotes and encourages action for change, not just knowing about global issues, but also being willing to take action for the greater good in one's local community and more further afield. It's certainly about values, and particularly respect, and about valuing diversity and understanding oneself and others, but also being active in developing a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. So there isn't one subject or learning area called global education. It's what we call a cross-curricular perspective. And we see it in three particular areas of the curriculum, but I would argue that there's a place for global education across all subjects and learning areas, because it's concerned with holistic issues about how the world works, understanding poverty in our own country and also internationally. And it's certainly about peace building and resolving conflict, promoting justice, equality, human rights, and it's about environmental sustainability and developing active local and global citizens. So we'll see some of these in various documents and also reflected in the national curriculum, but I do think there's a place for it being strengthened, and particularly the values underpinning global education. So what do we mean by a global citizen? It's someone who certainly has that awareness of the wider world and not just their own local community and local issues, and who understand their own responsibility as a world citizen and what that means, and share a sense of community and family with others beyond their own local community, and a sense of solidarity with others. Solidarity is not a word or a value that we use very much in Australia. Sometimes you find it in the union movement, but we've heard it quite a lot in relation to the war in Ukraine. We see people being in solidarity with the Ukraine. Sometimes I have some issues with that because I feel that I want to be in solidarity with everyone who is impacted by that war, including Russian families who are also suffering, including people around the world who are suffering perhaps hunger because they're not able to access grain which they might have accessed earlier from the Ukraine. So it affects all of us, and it's about being in solidarity with all those who are suffering, which involves care and compassion. It's definitely about the value of respect and valuing diversity, as I mentioned before, and a global citizen is one who is willing to contribute to a future where everyone's rights are equally respected, and where we work together towards sustainability and take responsibility for our actions and are willing to work for the greater good. It's interesting that the origins of global education began in the 1960s, and it focused very much on what we called development education, which was very much about developing countries, global poverty and inequality. But then in the 70s, it expanded to include environmental education, which we now recognise as education for sustainability, which includes peace and human rights. And then in the mid to late 70s, with multicultural education, Indigenous education, and languages education, where we learnt about other cultures. And then later still, recognising our role in Asia and in our region and engaging with Asia. Civics and citizenship education began later still, and then futures education in the 90s and 2000s. And now education for sustainable development, which really encompasses all of those areas in a holistic way. So you can see how global education has expanded over the decades. And all of those educational areas that are mentioned, they're interrelated and they share a common set of values. And global education emphasizes a number of areas that can be considered holistically together in terms of interdependence and equitable social progress, peace and sustainability, as I mentioned before, civic participation, which is not just about voting in a democracy, but it's about taking action and contributing more broadly. And of course, environmental care, as I mentioned before, and care for the natural world. So that does require a cross-curriculum approach. And there are 3 areas at the moment that I mentioned before, which is Indigenous education, the histories and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Australia's engagement with Asia, and education for sustainability. And as I mentioned before, I'd like to see global education. I think there's a place for it to be included across the curriculum in more learning areas, particularly in history and geography, in English and science as well. So global education brings these together in a very holistic way because it recognises that our world is interconnected. Every aspect of society is not separate. And it's often said you can't have peace without equity and social justice, just as you can't have prosperity without sustainability. So that interconnectedness is very much emphasised in global education. So why is it important? Not just because we're part of an interdependent and connected global community. We share many concerns, and we've seen recently in terms of climate change and natural disasters and the pandemic. These are things that we share across the world. Environmental degradation, we've had advances in telecommunications that bring us closer together than ever before. We're all experiencing food, water, and energy shortages, and the threats to peace and global security are not something that necessarily just occurs in one part of the world. We see that in many parts of the world. And of course, we've seen extensive migration. Also, global education, with its focus on children in other or communities in other parts of the world, less fortunate than perhaps our own, or even poverty within our own country, it can counter excessive individualism and selfishness. And there have been a number of research studies which has shown that there is an increasing level of selfishness in some Western countries, and particularly in Australia. So this focus on global education, emphasising how other people live, is an important part of that, so that it can foster in learners an appreciation of our own world, but also compassion and care for others, and responsibility for not simply saying, well, I'm okay, Jack, so I don't have to worry about anyone else. So I think that's important. It can also counter the values reflected in the culture of the screen, television, media generally, film, computer and video games. It can seem sometimes that the values in the culture of the screen are not those values that we would choose. Often those values are about violence or selfishness or revenge or jealousy, and trying to hold back those values through social media can seem like trying to hold back a tidal wave. So global education, and particularly values in early learning for young children in the first 7 years of life, are really important. So global education emphasises that we, even though we are individuals, we live in families, in communities, together with others, and we share the earth together and care for nature together. So as I said before, compassion and understanding, and working together for the greater good. are all important. So universal values or global values are promoted by global education, and we can see them reflected there in the areas covered by global education. So unity and interdependence, equity, peace, justice, sustainability, peace and harmony, respect, all of those values that I've mentioned before are reflected there, including cooperation, participation, and contribution. So what are those universal or global values, and where do they come from? I've analysed over 22 international UN documents that have been signed by many countries around the world, certainly countries that are members of the United Nations. And these values that are listed here are those that are most commonly reflected in those documents. And so it's not difficult to identify what are the values that should be integrated within education and through global education in particular. The problem is, and this is the difficulty with values, because what I'm saying sounds very straightforward and simple and idealistic. However, the problem comes with how those values are actually reflected in action and what they look like. And they do look different in different cultures and in different contexts. So education and parents and families have a role in role modelling values in practice, and they do look different depending on the context. And sometimes some values are more important in one context than in another. For example, in the UK right now, safety and security would be one of the most important values. Food security and water security and shelter would be extremely important. 2 years ago, those values may not have had as much importance as they do now. So values and the importance of them and where they are in terms of our hierarchy of values are different from one context to another, not only from one country to another, but also within our own country, because people live differently across our own country. Some cultures place greater emphasis on some values over others, and that can cause misunderstanding. So I'll give a couple of examples here. The value of respect and honouring other people can look very different in different cultures. In Australia, for example, when we place a high value on respect and honesty and integrity and equity as well. But in being honest, we're very direct and straightforward, which might be considered by other cultures to be disrespectful because we're so direct and upfront in our honesty, for example, in giving our opinion or giving our feedback on something. So others might be respectful by perhaps not expressing how they feel as honestly, or they might refrain from expressing themselves because they would consider it more important to honour the person by not disappointing them by saying something that might be considered disrespectful or negative or critical. So this is how misunderstandings can occur because of those cultural differences. So families and parents and schools do have a role in modelling values in action, and how they're reflected in our context, but also in understanding that how someone else might express a value might be different. So how do schools foster global education? Certainly they promote flexible learning and they empower students to learn about their world, but values education generally is important so that learners develop a positive sense of self, understanding of others, and appreciation of that diversity, and also a passion for justice, human rights, and sustainability. So that involves including global education values right across the school. And I've spoken about this on previous occasions, about how values need to be integrated right across the curriculum, but also in different aspects of schooling, including in policy, in the curriculum, and particularly in many activities that are organised at the school level, and where parents are involved as well. It's important to provide teachers with professional development in global education, so building their capacity to integrate global education in classroom activity and really place global education and values at the heart of teaching and learning. Some of you may have seen this diagram before. I use it a lot because I do promote a whole school approach to values and to global education, so that global education is seen in the learning environment where those values are modelled, in policy and governance, not only in the curriculum, but also the way in which teachers approach teaching and learning through the pedagogy, and how the whole learning community is involved, which includes local business and parents and families. And I've mentioned a couple of times how important the role of parents and families are in global education, so that they engage with their own children in age-appropriate conversation about relevant global issues, discussing these things at the dinner table with older children to reinforce the learning that is happening at school. But particularly the values formation in the early years, the first 7 years of life are really, 6 or 7 years are really important in values formation, as are the years of adolescence as well. And for parents to be modelling those values in their own actions, and to organise family activities such as donating to charity, taking gifts to local charities at Christmas and so on, and to encourage their children to participate in charity fundraising and local activities contributing to the environment and to the community. So thank you very much, everyone. Just in closing, I'd like to say that global education enables learners to live together in peace and harmony, care for and share the earth and its resources, so that we may sustain quality of life equitably for all, indefinitely into the future. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. We have 10 minutes allocated to questions now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands or show the hand icon, and we can put those questions to Dr. DeLeo. Now I'm going to jump in, as is my privilege, I think. How do you deal with global education as a unit, where
Yes.
the world is becoming multipolar, since the commencement of the pandemic, and we've got now the issue with Russia, China, and the West in that conflict? Because I think that what we're seeing is the multipolar community is emerging. How does that impact consistency?
Yes, and that's right. And given that I'm very involved with the Universal Peace Federation, and you are, Dr. Chris, as well, I struggle with issues around discussions that promote separateness, and I raised some of those issues earlier in relation to the Ukraine, because I recognise that war is having global impacts, and whilst we might be polarised, the impacts of the pandemic, of climate change, environmental degradation, war, even though it might be on the other part of the world, on the other side of the world, that it impacts all of us. And so it's difficult for those of us who are involved in peace education, because we don't want to separate ourselves from those who are suffering, who might be in the case of the war in Ukraine, who might be considered, who are the aggressor. This was brought home to me yesterday when I was listening to an interview with a Ukrainian soldier whose role it was to find the bodies of Russian soldiers, put them in body bags and send them back to families in Russia. A grisly task, but he was talking about his role, and he said, while it's not an enjoyable task, when he's doing it, he feels compassion for the families of those soldiers. And it really moved me so much that despite the suffering that he himself and his family and his community have suffered, that he felt that sense of connection with families in Russia. And so whilst we might be a polarizing world, I think that sense of interdependence and connectedness on this one small planet, that where we are sharing more than ever the issues that we're facing, that's something that should be promoted among learners who will be the adults of the future, who hopefully will be peacemakers themselves.
Thank you very much. Burhan Ahmed, your hand is raised. So if you'd like to unmute and direct your question, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'd really like to congratulate you. This is something that we need to all come to understand, because value of education is the cornerstone of any society to create leaders of values. And the world now lacks the values that we're all talking about. And when we talk about education, the majority of children born in third world are always behind. So to stop this world, how can we expand ourselves or reach out? We always say the girls and whatever, but majority of people are not reached. So my question is, well, look, to be honest with you, if there will be, UN, I see it as a weak body, but there should be some levy on airlines, some levy on international corporates to put something to support peace in the world. Peace cannot come by just sitting on the table and shaking hands. The root cause of peace is now in the region that I come from and many places. I see it's purely education. And I say to people, is American society united or Australian society united? No, they are more because of education, because of knowing themselves and knowing, understanding whatever. Ignorance, the other side, is killing everyone. Ignorance is the source of all what's coming. So it's great to hear, the presentation. But my question, which I always have a nightmare, is we talk about fairness, we talk about equality, we talk about many things. So is there any way we all need to look for a solution? Like the airline industry has got the biggest chunk of money going from A to B to C and other corporates. So how do we reach to those people who are not getting any support of education? Thank you.
Thank you, Burhan, and it's a very important question. And of course, there are United Nations organizations, and in particular UNESCO, which focuses on education for those in less developed countries. Unfortunately, if one looks at literacy levels around the world, just as one measure, the data shows that despite the heavy investment in literacy education, actually those levels are still remaining low, and inequality across the world has been not improving, has in fact been growing over a number of decades. So what you say is absolutely true. I wish I had the answer. And a levy, not only on airlines, but perhaps many more companies might be needed to address it. In actual fact, there have been estimates which have shown that to address education and to address inequality and hunger around the world, actually wouldn't cost as much as you might think. It would cost a fraction of what is actually spent on arms towards war around the world. So it's not a matter of cost, it's a matter of will. It's about having the will. And so global education and values in education attempts to reach children from a very young age so that we're promoting a generation of young people who have the values, the underpinning values, and the will to action for greater good. I don't know of any other way. I'm certainly not an economist and I'm not an expert in global politics. Education has been my field. And I do believe, like I think you do as well, on the importance of education and starting with children from a young age.
Just to say 2 points. First, I'm a product of the UNESCO education. As a refugee, I was taught in the refugee camp in Sudan, and I'm one of the beneficiaries of that. But that has gone out because the United Nations, or whatever you could name, has dropped the fund and most kids. But I am one of the product. If that happens, there will be more better than what I am now. Many others will benefit from that source of support. So, but also coming back to your word with the amount of education, if you follow the what you call the research institute, the Rockefeller, the American research, they already produced it at data, and they showed the figure of money and how much is needed for education and hunger. It was absolutely insignificant, less than 1% of what is spent in armaments and other things. So if the world, as you said, if there was a will, there was a way to solve that problem, but there is no will. Always showing the hunger is, and the war is a way that goes forward. So thank you. No, it's really great. Appreciate
Thank you, Berhad. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you. It was a engaging discussion. It'd be nice to Berhan, to hear about your life experiences at another time as well, because part of this forum here is not merely to ask questions, but also to engage with us and to have learnings. Now, John, you have your hand up. You have a quick comment to make?
Look, there was an article in the Washington Times, which I did send to some of you this week, and it was about the school shootings in the United States. And the writer of the article said, look, of course it's a police problem, of course it's a gun problem, but fundamentally it's a values problem. The United States is declining in its support. He was saying, look, what sustained this country is the family, the community. Even he said, look, in our, that we would trust the police, for example, and these things are breaking down. And so what we're doing here is not just vital, it's critical, because we cannot assume that Australia will not lose its value structure in the family. And so for me, this is what keeps me awake. It's what keeps me inspired to do this, because I realize that we have an absolutely critical task. So we approached the new Minister of Education with the new federal government, and we'd like to meet with them, and we've written an open letter. And please join us in that effort to really emphasize the importance of the long-term prosperity of this nation and the world based on values. It's not a question, it's just a comment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Dallaire. Now moving on to our second speaker, Mrs. Jenny Rickard, President of the Australia Parents Council, mother of 3 sons, navigating the last few years of high school. Good luck. Tough job. And post-school pathways, passionate supporter of parents being engaged and involved in their children's education. And the title of Ms. Rickard's presentation is An Exercise in Parent Self-Reflection to Enhance Child's Career Advice. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just share my screen. Hello, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose lands I live and work upon today. I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. I recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continuous connection to land, water, and culture of this vast land, and accept this has never been ceded. I pass this respect on to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be present today. My name is Jenny, and I'm first and foremost the mum of 3 teenage boys, and I have their permission to share this photo. I'm the president of the Australian Parents Council, and I'm one of the growing number of parents who choose a values-based education for their children, whilst having no strong connection to any faith tradition. To get a real understanding of my connection to values-based education, it is worth sharing the story of how we came to enrol our children in an independent non-government high school after a wonderful journey in public primary school. Like many Canberrans, we're not natives and were transplanted here due to my husband's work. Having no family support made us highly conscious of the fact we needed to build our own village to support us in our journey as parents. We also knew the source of this village would be situated around where our children were, and you cannot escape that for young people, that is school. A local school was certainly the priority when the boys were little. We wanted the opportunity for local playdates and valued the independence and adventure of being able to ride their bikes to and from school. But we quickly realised that high school and adolescence came with a fresh set of requirements, and our local high school couldn't meet those needs. In the end, we discovered it was a school's values that cemented our decision. Unlike the primary school we had attended, whose school values were singularly rooted in academic excellence, the high school we chose has 6 values that it celebrates annually. And there was one value that clearly stood out to us as a family. And I promise you, it's none of the ones that you might be thinking about. Every Sunday, for as long as I can remember, we have hosted the whole cul-de-sac, not just the neighbours, for Sunday afternoon scones. Now, scones are the only thing my husband can cook, and when he is away for work, as he often is, the boys take turns at cooking them for the street. Knowing that makes it completely understandable that sometimes we have scones and sometimes we have rock cakes. From this little anecdote, can you guess what the school's value is that resonated with our family enough for us to decide that this was the place we wanted to send them to for their most formative years? It is hospitality. Our school places hospitality of one of its 6 core values up there, along with compassion, heart, and forgiveness. This left of centre value beautifully aligns with our family values and was the main reason for our school choice. I tell you this story because it sets the scene quite nicely for how this project evolved for the Australian Parents Council. Let me introduce you to the problem we are attempting to solve. When it comes to parents' contribution as careers coaches or counsellors, it is well documented that parents are the biggest influence on career decisions. The Study Work Grow report into parental engagement in career education lists a very long list of citations that parents are #1 influencers of their children's post-school decisions and play more of a role than their teachers, careers advisors, or friends. Not only do children use their families to gather information on careers, but they also highly trust the information that they do get from their family. They value this knowledge more than the material they find on the internet, thank goodness, what their friends share with them, and even the information that they get from their school's career advisors. And despite this high reliance and high trust children place in their parents and families, the outcomes are not always empowering for children. There are many contributing factors to why the success rate of parents being the biggest influence on their kids' careers don't convert to perfect outcomes. Firstly, we know that parents don't have great access to the most up-to-date current career information. Mostly they're informed by their own personal experiences, which feel like yesterday, but in actual fact could be from decades ago. Additionally, these can either be favourable personal experiences or aspirational experiences, like, for example, refugee parents who highly value education as being the way out of poverty and persecution, who favour university pathways over vocational pathways for the perceived pay and security benefits. This also means the influence parents use is highly emotional, and we'll talk more about that later. Next, parents are busy, not only with their own lives and being parents, but also with the other contributing factor to the influence on the advice they give, their own career. The funny thing about careers advice as a parent is that you may still be figuring out your own career pathway whilst your children are formulating their plan of their own. This is definitely a defining feature of this conundrum. So while we know lots about how parents influence career decisions, we don't know a lot about the most effective way to leverage this influence for the individual good of their children. But what do we know about leveraging parental knowledge and how this already plays out in homes and schools across the country? We know that parents are notoriously hard to reach. Often educational institutions are used as the conduit to reach parents. So we began our investigation with what information and resources in career guidance were readily available for parents. What we found was death by hyperlink. Contained in this is a huge amount of information, but forms a labyrinth of following hyperlinks to other websites or government departments, along with screens of dry, boring written information. It is a maze of information, one of which most parents do not have the time or inclination to unravel. We were not surprised to find that this area of education is no different from other areas we experience in the space of parental engagement. There are shed loads of information for students. There are heaps of activities and infos for teachers. There are truckloads of information written by professionals that should parents. You know, the ones that have a big list of what we should be doing, you know, the do this or follow that checklist, or by now you should, but there's no information written by parents for parents. Using the parent lens, information that leverages parents and positions the knowledge they hold about their children as valuable, evidence-based, and important. Often we are faced with opposition when we advocate for parental knowledge to be valued and positioned within education conversations. Parents are very much positioned as consumers of education and its byproduct, not experts in their own right. However, this one simple fact remains. Parents are a child's first, most important, and most consistent teacher. From teaching a child how to use a knife and fork to teaching them to drive, parents are intentionally and accidentally teaching their children using a wide and diverse range of approaches, and whilst not specifically pedagogical in nature, still relevant and robust. However, rarely is the work conducted by parents regarded by schools and society as teaching. Perhaps because parents' work is conducted organically with only on-the-job training. Their work is conducted emotionally with every hope and dream for their child woven into the work that they do. And lastly, there are very few rules, no qualifications, and certainly no manual on how to do the work. And with all of this, parents, like teachers, never escape the gaze of the public eye and the susceptibility of open critique of their performance. We found most careers coaching information, activities, and assistance is created with this in mind, the do this but not that type of information that tells it like it should be when there is no clear understanding of how it actually eventuates in real life practice, along with the expectation that you should know it all, be able to do it all, and enthusiastically keep up with the latest training and work trends. The beauty of the way the Australian Parent Council approaches all of its projects, and the way it has done so for over 60 years now, is to fully view issues through the parent lens with full understanding that it looks and feels different for every parent. While we strive to honour everyone's difference, there are some foundational aspects of parenting that remain the same. Noting here that we use an inclusive model of parenting, be it grandparents, a foster parent, an aunt or uncle, or a caring adult. Parenting is highly dependent upon the basic principle of values. We know what parents across the country value is different. Therefore, it is not up to us to bang on that parents should value or advocate that they should value something else. We work in the bounds of knowing that all parents are doing their best to love and value their children, and we honour that. We lovingly embrace and support families to maintain their cultural and ancestral values, which is vitally needed in the education environment. The impact and influence of intergenerational career messages cannot be ignored when working through a family and parental lens. Another angle often missed by not viewing issues through a parent lens is the opportunity for parents to hone their parenting nous via strengthening themselves as a person. While this project's objectives are absolutely about increasing the efficacy of the careers guidance parents give, we are not using the child as the vessel. We are using contemplation and reflection of the adult to bring about change or consolidation, as the case may be. So often children are used as the mechanism to improve parents' outcomes, but this negates the opportunity for the adult to do the work for themselves. Education institutions are particularly guilty of this approach because their focus is the child, even though they absolutely recognise that they require the input of the child surrounding adults. Often it seems schools are backed into a corner by society and what society views schools' purpose to be. The response is then to provide teaching moments to parents, usually in much the same way they teach children, which makes sense because it's where their expertise lays, but it isn't something we believe is effective. So right from the beginning of this project, we were looking for something that a parent could do for themselves to improve the work they did with their children. Interestingly enough, we didn't settle on a values exercise first up. Initially, we were looking for a quiz for parents to ascertain what kind of parent they were and how that impacted upon their parenting advice and careers coaching. We're truly thankful that our research led us to Dr. Suzanne Kremen, and she has led us on a journey of truly understanding archetypes, values, and authentic engagement in this area and steered us clear of reinforcing stereotypes. Dr. Suzanne Kremen will speak next. We'll unpack the theory of the work we have done. But before she does, I wanted to summarize the brief of the project, the brief for this project. As we have stated before, while parents are the biggest influence on their children's future career paths, not much is known about how to leverage parents to use that influence for better outcomes. There are a lot of words banded around like pressure, disappointment, successful, and expectations when it comes to the conversations parents have with their children about careers. The Australian Parents Council set out in partnership with the National Careers Institute to learn how that leverage could be utilised for better outcomes for children. It has been a wild journey with many lessons learnt, but we are thrilled to have put together a tool comprising of values card sorting activities, reflection activities, and a genogram that sit beside our resources information hub that positions parents' knowledge of their children powerfully and empowers parents to undertake self-reflection on their values and ponder how their values impact the work they do as parents. This piece of work has been an honour, working alongside Suzanne and testing these tools on many parents like Ilham. We have created a tool to empower parents to clearly understand their values and how they inform the work they do as parents. It has been a powerful experience. The values cards and associated activities are truly groundbreaking. Adding this piece of work to the already outstanding body of work the Australian Parents Council has delivered on valuing parent engagement in its 60 years has been transformational. While these sorts of tools already exist in careers counselling and psychological practice, this is the first time they have been developed to encompass the many aspects of parents' work and holistically encompass their lives. I would now welcome the opportunity to take any clarifying questions on the premise of the project or about the Australian Parents Council itself before we move on to Dr. Suzanne Kremen, walking you through the theoretical background of this project. Please feel free to use this link to register your interest in the launch of the website and its tools when they become available.
Well, thank you very much. It's fascinating. I want to log on and have a look at that toolkit myself. We might just hold off questions for a little while, but thank you kindly. And now we've introduced Dr. Susan Kremen, founder of the Life Artistry Centre, where she teaches and consults in vocational applications of archetypal psychology. Her background includes working as a lawyer, screenwriter, legal and scholarly publisher, conference producer, managing director, and career counsellor for adults in midlife. She is the author of From Career to Calling, a depth psychology guide to soul-making work in darkening times, published by Routledge in 2020, which was a finalist in the Australian Career Book Awards. Susan has a passion for helping people rethink ideas about work and careers and so brings their authentic selves to the world, fostering innovation and creativity, respect for diversity, and a sustainable and equitable future. Dr. Kremen was a founding member of the National Interfaith Association of Australia, board member of the inaugural National Interfaith Festival on the Sunshine Coast, Queensland in 2007, which was awarded the grand prize in the Australian Multicultural Marketing Awards. Dr. Kremen's presentation today is entitled An Exercise in Parental or Parent Self-Reflection to Enhance Child's Career Advice. Dr. Kremen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And let me see how I go now with sharing my screen. Is that appearing?
Absolutely, yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So hello everyone, and it's an honour to be here today. I'm joining you from the Sunshine Coast hinterland in Queensland, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here, the Jinnaburra people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm delighted to be joining Jenny and Ilham today to talk about the development of an innovative values activity for the Australian Parents Council. This was an interesting brief for me, and I'd like to take you behind the scenes a little first to give you some background on how it came about, because in that I believe lies a key to its power and efficacy, and its somewhat different approach to appreciating the centrality of values in our lives. So Jenny contacted me last year to see if I'd be interested to work with the Australian Parents Council on the development of a parenting archetypes quiz to support parents with exploring and discussing career directions with their children. Now, I come to this work with a broad occupational and educational background, but it's important to say I bring a very different theoretical and psychological lens towards thinking about values from many of you here with a background or an interest in values education. Nevertheless, I hope you'll find something worthwhile and perhaps even challenging and provocative in this approach. My PhD at La Trobe University was on the depth psychology of vocation and careers. And for years, I've been teaching, writing, and working with individuals, particularly around thinking more deeply about our ideas of career, vocation, and calling, and drawing on insights from analytical psychology and archetypal psychology. And I hold a particular interest in the interdisciplinary applications of archetypal psychology towards different contexts and walks of life. So I was excited by this brief, and that the president of the Australian Parents Council was inspired to create an interactive website activity drawing on the concept of archetypes, which she thought would be an intriguing hook for parents. But I had to ask her, what do you mean by the word archetype, and what do you think archetypes are? Because there's a lot of popular misunderstanding about archetypes. And although this area, which is part of the field of analytical psychology, is part of a long-standing field of scholarship and a recognized psychological approach in particularly in European, North American, and other countries, it's not taught at Australian universities, and the concept of archetypes, which originates with Plato, is often understood in a superficial manner and dismissed. So I suggested it would be useful if I prepared an initial report for the Parents' Council, including some salient points about the theory and the complex nature of archetypes and the different ways of understanding them. From this theoretical basis, I then made some recommendations for directions the Parents' Council could take for a quiz or a tool, which would then have a sound evidentiary basis in both archetypal psychology and vocational psychology. So without going into the theory and research on archetypes, which is complex, and in the brief time I have with you today, I don't have time to do that any justice. But what I would like to emphasize is the last point on this slide, that the most common way in which we encounter archetypes on a daily basis is in the perspectives that rule our ideas and our feelings about the world, our work, our families, and ourselves. And this last point, when you stop to think about it, sounds a lot like values. And as I'll explain in a moment, a synonym for archetype is value. So for example, let me read these points about archetypes, but let's substitute the word values for archetypes or for archetypal factors or influences, and you'll start to see what I mean. Values are important because they shape the perspectives that rule our thoughts and feelings about the world and about ourselves. Values influence our interactions with others and what we consider to be important. As such, whether we're aware of them or not, values play a significant role in both parent-child relationships and in an individual's choice of study and a career path. So a synonym for archetype is value. And we can know that we're in the territory of archetypes when we know what it is that we value. As you know, a value may be something like compassion, courage, integrity, security, independence, cooperation, scientific knowledge, creativity, power, caring for others, any of the universal global values which Dr. Joy before me so eloquently spoke about, or hospitality, which Jenny also spoke about, any ultimate value. So one way of gaining a sense of what archetypes are currently active in one's life is by reflecting on the question, what do I value? And it was this particular way of understanding archetypes which led to one of my recommendations that was ultimately adopted by the Parents' Council, that an effective way of encompassing the age-old concept of archetypes without even mentioning the word archetype would be to create a values tool or activity for parents. And the beauty of this approach is that a values inventory or values card sort is an established technique used by career counsellors alongside other kinds of inventories like skills and interests. Unfortunately, the power of working with individuals' values has been largely overlooked because many career counsellors simply don't have the skills to know how to work more deeply, therapeutically, and even transformatively with the concept of values. Indeed, at the federal government level, the focus regarding vocational and career pathways has been directed entirely onto skills and skill sets in the Australian Qualifications Framework, in the Australian Core Skills Framework, and values really doesn't receive a mention. So, of course, skills are our tools for work, which we can acquire or improve. Yet it is our values which determine whether the work we do with our skills holds meaning and fulfillment for us, which is more important than ever in these critical and uncertain times, I believe. Values give us the guiding context for how and where and to what purpose we will apply our skills. So the first stage in rolling this project out with the Parents' Council was the development of a values card activity. And this is an exercise in sorting over 60 cards, of which a small selection is here on the screen, with values printed on them, different kinds of values, into 4 categories, being most important, important, nice but not essential, and not important. And one of the key, really one of the very few key guidelines to doing this exercise is that only 10 cards or values are allowed in the top category, which compels the person doing the activity to go through a really a sorting and a distilling exercise. Ilham will talk more in a moment about her experience as a parent with using the cards. The values on these cards do not purport to be conclusive or even right, but they're a starting point for self-reflection. Parents undertaking the activity are encouraged to modify, to amend, or add to the values on the cards, to personalize them and add any important values that they feel are missing. Now, traditionally, when helping clients think about values, career counsellors have tended to focus upon values specifically relevant to a job or a workplace, such as I value flexible working hours or a high income. So it's quite a narrow idea of values in a certain context. However, especially during the pandemic, the division between work and life has been dissolved for many, and it was probably always a somewhat artificial division anyway. The Australian Parents Council cards encompass a holistic range of personal, family, community, financial, spiritual, health, environmental, and other life values, as all of these areas provide the wider context within which parenting and work occurs. The values on the cards are not just limited to character virtues or societal values, such as the universal global values, so beautifully described by Dr. Joy Delio, which one might espouse or advocate for. Although those virtues are certainly there and people are encouraged to add them. But there's deliberately a mix of different types of values in these cards, including material things such as one's own home, a reliable income, a pet, a nice car. As the reality is that we're every day faced with decisions which compel us to choose to make difficult decisions, often between different types of values. And Joy mentioned previously the rise in selfishness that we're seeing in our society globally, or certainly in wealthy Western countries like Australia. So this exercise really invites individuals to a personal reflection and even a reckoning with the values they're living and the choices they're making. So through all of this, the word archetype is never used, and yet the whole values activity is actually underpinned and shaped by an understanding that values are themselves archetypal. And some of the implications of this are that, firstly, the exercise and the Australian Parents Council do not espouse or promote any particular values as right. As Jenny said in her presentation. Instead, there's simply the encouragement to parents to notice and to reflect upon what values are guiding them. The idea is to bring a perspective and a posture of curiosity and contemplation towards the values we are living. A second point is that it's natural for our values to change at different life and developmental stages. And while a few core values will remain with us throughout life and go to the essence of who we are, other values will come and go according to the context in which we find ourselves living and our developmental stage. Thirdly, given their archetypal nature, and this is a really kind of interesting point, values have a tendency to constellate their opposite, which we experience as inner or outer conflict or tension. For example, the conflict between freedom and security along the archetypal pole of independence, or a conflict between belonging and authenticity, which might raise the question for us, to whom do I give my allegiance or my fidelity? Is it to the group, to the family, to others, or is it to the depths of my own soul? So these are the kinds of tensions we can find ourselves holding. The last point here is that the values that drive us and guide us are not necessarily conscious. Values are always shaping us and influencing our behaviour, whether we're aware of them or not. And parents who project their own values, including their unfulfilled dreams or their ambitions for their lives and careers onto their children, may unconsciously burden that child with a need to redeem the parent's own missed potential, their unrealized vocational desires, or their unlived life. And this is neatly summarized and encapsulated in a quote from the Swiss psychologist and founder of analytical psychology, Carl Jung, who observed that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. And in my vocational work with adults in midlife, I've witnessed this parental pressure that adults received as children to be one of the most common causes of later life occupational problems and career dissatisfaction. As a young person, they often chose a course of study or a career path that a parent thought was a good idea for them, perhaps because it appeared to offer security, high income, or status, or was a continuation of the family business. Or it might have been an occupation that the parent themselves would have ideally chosen if they'd had the means or the opportunity to do so, and so they thought this would be a desirable occupational path for their child. In any case, there's a failure to see the child for who they really are and to appreciate and support the vocational direction to which that child's interests and talents were optimally suited. So parents who become self-aware of the values which are driving them, including how and where those values arose, are less likely to burden their own unconscious, habitual, or unreflected values onto their children. So to encourage this, we developed a couple of worksheets with reflection, questions and activities, such as how have your values changed from 2, 10 or 20 years ago? Where do you see areas of conflict between your values? How does this conflict show up in your life? For example, does the conflict show up internally in anxiety, indecisiveness, frustration or depression? Or externally in your relationships with others? What values once seemed important or nice to have, but that you may now need to let go of for more essential values? So the worksheets also contain questions as prompts to explore intergenerational messages around work and careers, such as what messages did your parents give you through their words or their actions about values and about work? What message would you have liked your parents to have given to you? If you had a family crest, what would be the family motto inscribed upon it? And is there a career or occupation that you would have liked to have pursued, but you did not or could not? What attracted you to that work? And what happened so that you took a different path? Then there are 4 activities that parents may like to do with their kids, such as inviting their older children or their partners to do the values card activity 2, interviewing other family members, such as grandparents or aunts and uncles, about their vocational hopes and dreams, drawing a genogram or a family tree of their ancestors' occupations and achievements, and creating a collage or a vision board of their core values. So lastly, there's a values quiz, which goes back to the original brief of providing a way in for people, or a hook, an invitation to then do the full values cards and reflect on the questions. And this quiz poses several different levels of choices and questions around values, which parents can do on screen straight away to get them started with thinking about how different values are at play in their own lives and how they accommodate them, particularly when they find themselves faced with a conflict of values. So we encourage you to go to the My Kids Career website, and I hope that a link can be put up about that in the chat function, perhaps, if it isn't already, which will be live soon. And to take a look at the materials yourselves and to try them out. Then just very briefly, because Ilham will be speaking further about this shortly, what we found in terms of the benefits of doing these activities are that parents reported a variety of beneficial outcomes, including greater self-insight, awareness of intergenerational patterns, a new perspective on inner psychological conflict and outer interpersonal relationship conflicts, renewed clarity of purpose, and also increased respect for their child's unique vocational journey. So that's all from me for the moment. And I think we were moving into a little discussion here with Jennifer Rickard, the president of the Australian Parents Association, who I'd like to invite back into the presentation at this stage to comment on a couple of important points that arose during this process of developing the materials. And the first of those, I think, was that we discovered, Jennifer, was the importance of maintaining authenticity. And perhaps you'd like to say a few words about that.
Absolutely. So providing an authentic activity for parents to do some real reflection upon themselves was really important to us. But it was also the authenticity of the project. We didn't want to just provide something that could be gamified or pushed aside as not being meaningful. A critical part of it was that it was authentic, that it would have meaning, and that parents could participate in it fully, and it would have an impact upon the work that they do. So that's something that we kept coming back to ensure that we were covering, because one of the other things, and Suzanne and I will talk about this as well, is that one of the things we found ourselves easily sliding into was that the parenting and working with your children, you easily slide into the work that I do on my children. So we discussed often how we could make sure and really retain this as an activity for parents to do, not for parents to do on their child, or to critique their child's values, or to tell their child they had the wrong value. So we did often discuss keeping it authentic about parents' work, keeping it authentic about the values that people hold, but also not being another activity that it gets done to children in the name of parenting. I think that kind of covers off our journey on this, doesn't it, Suzanne?
Yes, I think you've expressed that really well, Jenny. And that was one of the things we had to keep bringing the project back to, which was that this particular brief wasn't about educating children about values. It was helping parents with, it wasn't even about giving parents solutions in a way, it was about giving parents tools and better questions. Because what we found is when parents have the right tools to make connections themselves and they're given better questions in a non-kind of judgmental context, they can form, there's a lot of insights that occur in that way. And that in itself, I think someone mentioned here the importance of kind of modeling values. And so children can readily see through their parents, or we can see through when our leaders are being hypocritical about values. So again, this exercise is an invitation for people to do in a private space some self-reflection and some real thinking about what is it, not just that I espouse, but that I'm living.
And I think that's so critical, Suzanne, because my experience and my children are in the later years of high school, but if their school does not encompass the vows that they espouse, they really notice that it is hypocritical, and they push back against that. So it's so important to be living the values that we say we're going to live. And that's why we thought it was really important to examine a parent's values, so you can live the values that you say you're going to live. And our schools will get, really do a better job of living the values that they say they hold as values. And I think I gave a really good example of that, because we did look for a school that lived its values. We had experienced one that didn't have, you know, values that held true for us as a family, but we found a school now that does live those values, and it makes such a difference in raising children. I think we probably need to hand back to Chris now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kremen and Mrs. Ricard. Fascinating discussion, which will no doubt continue and receive input from the group. My pleasure now to receive another parent's perspective, another board member of the Australian Parent Council's perspective, Mrs. Ilan Sabri Ahmed, Chartered Accountant, board member of the Australian Parents Council, also participated in the case study of this work. Mother of 2 active girls, one in the final year of schooling and the other who just completed high school, Ilham believes that values and impacting our actions as we navigate through life. They define us as a person and also influence and empower us in various aspects of parenting, including in career-related conversations with children. And her presentation is entitled An Exercise in Parent Self-Reflection to Enhance Child's Career Advice. Mrs. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Just give me a second while I set myself up, please.
Okay. Okay, we can see your presentation. All good.
Okay, thank you. Just one second again. Thank you, Chris, once again. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Brisbane. I pay my respects to the Yagarabul and Banjalung people on whose land I live and present from today, and their elders past, present, and emerging. I was born and I grew up in Sri Lanka for most of my childhood, having spent part of my childhood in Africa as well. I left Sri Lanka almost 25 years ago, and having lived in Southern Africa and Dubai in the Middle East, I now call Australia my home. As Suzanne mentioned, I participated in the case study on behalf of Australian Parents Council, and I would like to share with you my personal experience. Before I dive right in, I'd like to invite you to take a look at the next 2 slides and engage with the thoughts that spring to your mind. Now, the first slide is a succinct representation of what Suzanne has already expressed. That is that our values are an integral part of who we are and that they guide us as we navigate through life. The second slide is interesting in that these values are so deep-seated within us that they will govern us regardless of whether we consciously discover or even acknowledge them. It is our autopilot, so to speak. Flowing from that, it stands to reason that we would only benefit by making the effort to delve into ourselves, to identify and familiarize ourselves with our values, especially considering the enormous impact it has on our parenting. So what did this exercise involve? As Suzanne mentioned briefly in her presentation, the entire exercise comprised 3 elements. The first step involved, as you can see on the left of your screen, sorting over 60 cards with various values on them into 4 categories as most important, good to have, and not important. The second element was to engage in 7 deeply reflective questions about my values. The third element was what we call intergenerational exploration, and I'll come to that later on in the presentation. Was this activity useful to me and why? It definitely acted as a conscious affirmation of what I held dear and practiced almost unconsciously. It was encouraging that certain core values like honesty, trust, integrity, education, and learning had remained constant within me and ranked at the top throughout my life, regardless of what age or stage of life I was in. It also made me aware that some values had changed over the last 10 to 20 years. For example, receiving recognition and time for myself, for obvious reasons, are not as important as it was 10 to 20 years ago. Excuse me. Also, beauty and physical appearance, although I do value how I present myself, one has to acknowledge the ticking of the biological clock and graciously accept the changes that come with it. So that's another thing that I realized. The activity also made me realize that the values of belonging, authenticity, diversity, culture, and personal expression have sometimes had to slide down in importance as an adaptation mechanism. And this is true for most migrants that I meet as well. What did I learn about myself? Firstly, this whole exercise was extremely insightful. You see, one has to quieten the mind and consciously slow down to reflect on the various values presented on these cards. This by itself was, I would say, therapeutic. When I started delving into the relevance of these values to myself, I quite literally embarked on a journey of self-discovery and even engaged sometimes, I would say, in a certain degree of individuation. I realized also that I had evolved as a person over the years, that I was adaptable, and also that frustration, feelings of injustice, even disillusionment I may experience from time to time were related to conflicts in values or the suppression of values that I hold dear. Did I learn something that I hadn't realized before? Indeed, I did. Excuse me. I say this because as parents, I strongly believe we are in a privileged position and make decisions on behalf of our children. But it is they, meaning our children, who have to live the consequences of these decisions. Also, it's daunting because we don't really fully understand the ground situation that our children are in when they live out the decisions we make on their behalf. I also devised what I now call the values test through this exercise. That is, when I'm faced with competing options, I realize if I give a higher weightage to the alternative that best aligns with my values, a decision almost organically emerges. And that decision is not something that goes against my grain, and it's sustainable in the long run. And this to me was a very valuable discovery while engaging in this process. Did I identify other important but missing values to add to the cards? Yes, I did. There were two that I identified. One was mutual respect, and the other was effective communication. Now, much is spoken about expressing oneself, making oneself understood, and having a voice, and so on and so forth. But I also think communication is critical. And when I say communication, it refers to not only expressing one's ideas, but the other party engaging with it and responding. It involves a feedback loop. And I strongly believe for any relationship to thrive, it is important to uphold this. Did I experience any resistance or challenges to the exercise or areas of conflict? Yes. Firstly, it was extremely hard to whittle down 10 most important values. And I'm so glad I don't have to do this on a daily basis. Out of 60 plus, that was difficult. I also realized that in the areas of diversity, culture, and personal expression, I discovered that there is a degree of suppression of these values at times to uphold the value of belonging. And through discussions with my children, I discovered that at times this may be the case for my daughters as well. Also, with regards to belonging, I realized that sometimes there's conflict between the values of belonging and authenticity and integrity. And this may be a constant struggle that our teenagers experience, because they may have a set of values that they're brought up with, but they might find it hard to uphold that when they're with their peers and have to give in to something that is not aligned with their internal values. So these things came to the surface while engaging in this exercise. Next, I'd like to look at my daughter's participation in this exercise. So my 17-year-old daughter participated in this, and this is what her sorting of cards looked like. It appears on your left compared to mine. When I compared the two sortings of the cards, it was heartening that 5 of my core values figured in my daughter's as well. This was quite a bit of a surprise to me, actually. So things like family relationships, education and learning, resilience, stable income, and health coincided in both our sorts of the top 10 most important values. So I share 50% common ground with her, which was, again, like I said, very reassuring. I was humbled that helping others was one of her most important values. It truly humbled me that there was much I could learn from her in that respect. Also, her motto, work hard, play hard, resonates with my values of appreciating education, effort, and hard work. My greatest takeaway that I'd like to share with other parents from my daughter's participation is that there's much we can learn as parents from our children's values. Often we are rather judgmental or too ready to dismiss their values. It is important to remember that we too, as parents, had a hand in shaping our children's values, and to have an open mind to the possibilities that our children could present to us. Next, let's take a look at what I referred to before, the intergenerational exploration. So up on the screen, you can see a photo of 4 ladies. These ladies represent 4 generations of my family, going back to my grandmother. And the little one in the cradle is the one who did the exercise in the previous slide. And this is very special because we are all the eldest in our generations. And this is what we call a genogram. Here you can see, sorry, the different occupations that my family pursued or engaged in. So looking at this genogram, you see that for generations, tertiary and professional education has been valued highly by my family. You can also see that my family upheld a broad-based education encompassing the sciences, business, and the arts. They also valued entrepreneurship and risk-taking as much as exact sciences such as medicine and the thoroughness of legal studies. And here, this is me. So it is no surprise that my career too was influenced by my family and ancestors, embodied a diversity that I truly cherish. My first degree was in business, and then I qualified as a chartered accountant. Prior to that, I completed my teacher's diploma in speech and drama. So effectively, I did both what my father and mother did. No compulsion by them, but I just gravitated to both their fields. Whilst working at Ernst & Young as an auditor, I also worked part-time as a news anchor and program presenter on national television. Moving countries after serving as the regional head of finance for a large multinational group, I now find governance work extremely stimulating and rewarding. And this year, after a break of over 20 years, I auditioned for a Shakespearean production and had the most rewarding experience stepping back on stage. I simply found myself. My life is enriched by this diversity, and these values have definitely been passed on to my girls, who engage in a variety of creative pursuits on top of their very demanding academic lives. What messages did my parents give through their words and their actions? Most certainly the value of education, the value of hard work, grit and perseverance, teamwork. Mom and dad always did things together. At least in our presence. The value of pay. I had a rather conformist upbringing, and they were quite strict on me. And I had these very strict social norms to adhere to, which didn't quite sit well with me at that stage in my life. And I also wish that they had given me more opportunities to take risks. Like I said, I had a fairly sheltered upbringing, and even now I struggle with taking big risks. And this is something I try to ensure I don't repeat with my girls. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with this bit of wisdom from Khalil Gibran that I often draw inspiration from. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very impressed by the quality of presentations and the messaging. And I think before we go into questions, we should thank all of our speakers in the usual way for really informing us as to some cutting edge thinking, but practical activities as well. Now we open it up for questions. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask some questions. I might ask Ilan if she could remove the share screen, and that way we can see people who have questions that they'd like to ask. Wonderful, thank you very much. All right, who would like to open up the auction? Oh. Who's that? Okay, well, so I'll ask a question just to kick off. I sit on a school board, independent school in Melbourne, Victoria, very much religion, faith-based. And for me, it was eye-opening sitting on as a board member, because both as a student, my parents had no involvement with the school. Migrant parents, no involvement. They were just a little bit like our last speaker, go to school, do really well. That's what we're paying for. Don't worry about too much else. The values you'll get at home, you've got your values you get with your church, not a problem. But being on the school board, the school has a very active parent association. So that as every 5-6 years, there's renewing strategic plans, business plans. We brought on a new board. We looked at redoing vision values. So the parent association was one of the core elements of what it is we should be, how we should be conducting ourselves with values-based mechanism, in addition to the Archdiocese. But they sort of gave us a little bit of a direction, but most of it, I was really surprised that the parent association was driving. And we as a board, and I'm really pleased that the rest of the board members and all of us agreed, we put a lot of weight on what the Parents Association was, what their belief systems were and what the values were, because they'd had several kids, some in junior school, some in high school. They'd been there for a lot longer than we had been, so they knew a lot about the DNA of the school. So my question is, the DNA of the school, how does that impact your activities with your toolbox and questions and activities? So maybe we'll put this question to the representatives from the Australian Parents Council.
Yeah.
And I don't care who jumps in first.
I'm
just
happy
go
to jump in. I've just got the sun streaming in my window though, but I'm happy to jump in. So the toolkit that we have developed is completely user-friendly and to be able to use in any context that you like. And I'll give it a great example. So one of the things that we have done with this tool is we've tested and tested and tested. And interestingly enough, despite the fact we've set it up to help parents with careers counselling of their children, these cards were actually used in the context of a family was struggling with their school choice. Their child had been struggling in the school environment that they had selected. And they selected the school for a very specific purpose, but now the child's been in the school for a couple of years, there's issues. So they actually went through the card sorting exercise and went through the thinking and came to the realization that the values that they thought they were looking for in a school were not the same values that they actually wanted once they got in practice. So they were able to decide that the idea of that they wanted a school for the status and the prestige and to give their child a leg up into, you know, the next stage in life, wasn't actually something that was important to them once they got there, and it wasn't playing out the way that they wanted it. So the cards, because of the way that they've been designed, they kind of transfer across contexts. So, you know, I mean, you could get every single parent in your school to download these cards and to submit their 10 values that they came up with. And it would be a fascinating exercise to see how often they crossed over as a school community. That would be a fascinating exercise, which I'd love to try. But basically, it's not up to us to decide what people value. I think in the school context, you do want to form a community around those values. And I think I spoke to that earlier. And I think it's very important that schools really articulate what their values are, that they live them and they show them off in the work that they do. So if you think that school open days, when parents are coming to see if they're going to join that school community, it's so vital that those school values be on display, so that you can make that choice if your family aligns with those school values. And I think things like that is often underplayed. You know, schools want to put out their NAPLAN value, their NAPLAN scores or their ATAR values, but you know, in the years of year 7 to year 12, NAPLAN and ATAR are really, really not important and don't help me as a parent, but knowing that my values align with the school does.
Thank you. Ilman, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something to what Jenny said, Chris. I totally get you when you say on a school board and the parental pressure. I myself just stepped down from a school board 2 months ago. So the way I see how we could marry the values in the values cards with the school's values is the cards represent 60 plus values, and each school, the school board I was on is an ecumenical school. So we have like 4 core values: mutual respect, integrity, excellence, and so on. So these 60 cards would fit into these 4 categories. I mean, you could sort them, so to speak. And that could be a great exercise for the kids in the classroom to do. We could say, okay, these are the 4 values of the school. Where would these values then come under these 4 umbrellas? And that way it's kind of narrowing down and further dissecting those big values into smaller values, which can then be applied in their lives and take home and share with the family and so forth. But it's a totally, it is hard to navigate through different and conflicting values that some schools would face with the very diverse parent population. But again, each unto themselves, but under the umbrella of the school's values, you can bring these in and weave it in quite harmoniously. That's what I would like to add.
Thank you. John, please.
My question is to all the participants. So you know, my background is actually I'm a high school teacher. That's what pays the bills, and it's my career in Victoria. And I have my 2-part question. The first part is to our presenters. Do you think that the parents of schools, whether in this country in Australia, do they really know the values of the school? And does the school really communicate those? And I don't mean like just, you know, you can go to, I'm honest here, you can go to any website, any school in Victoria, and they've got values. Okay, so yep, fine. But what really is happening, I have to say to you, and I want to ask your comment, is it really, do the schools really communicate and really to parents what they're really going on about and when they mean those values? And are the parents really asked to contribute? And that might be very different from school to school, but I wanted to ask you, is that an issue that if I met with the Minister of Education, could that be an issue that I would bring up?
I'm happy to jump in. First of all, John, thank you. We really do value your work as a teacher, and parents and teachers couldn't do it without each other. So firstly, thank you very much. And to answer your point, I would say that I see it playing out as being extremely tokenistic in schools. You do have some schools that absolutely embody their school values. They live them, they talk about them, they discuss them as a community. And even to the point that, Chris, you might find that your school discovered what their values were together as a community. And I would encourage school communities to undertake that as the practice, to bring that whole community along in establishing the values. But when values are tokenistic and, you know, put on the website but not lived in their daily practice, it becomes tokenistic, and then the parents don't know what the values are. They might recognize it because they're put in the school's emblem, and, you know, if you got lucky, they might be able to tell you what the values are. But yeah, I think the difference is those that practice their values and those who take a really tokenistic approach to it. Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago here in the ACT, the public schools put in their annual parent survey, did you know what the school values were? So I think communities and governments are looking to see how well schools are doing that work, because it is a vital part of schools' work. I firmly believe that living values, teaching values, bringing a community together under the umbrella of values is exceptionally important.
Absolutely. Well, let me give you a funny scenario with me. So I came onto the board and they said, "Oh, Chris, you know, what can you bring?" And I said, "Yes, I've got a lot of international experience. I'm interested in excellence, you know, US. I've got friends at Harvard, Oxford, etc., etc. And we could bring some practices." And they said, "That's great, but you know, how does it fit into our values, and how will the exercises be values driven?" And I scratched my head thinking, "Oh, that's a tough question." But then you figure it out. And what's fascinating now is that we're seeing in society a push towards liberalism, and that's fine. But a number of parents are saying, "Hang on a second, it's just happening too quickly, and I can't deal with that in our culture at home. So I need a school that can manage it slightly different to what the community is doing." So we're finding that the school that I sit on the board at is receiving lots of students from different cultural backgrounds, but they're saying, "You know what, the love, excel, dream, you know, they're unusual values, but we get it. You know, it's not about, you know, academic excellence. You want to go there? Yep, there are schools for that." And we're finding people from all walks of life bringing their kids here, saying, "We're a bit scared about, you know, what's happening in some of the public environments. The kids at your school seem happy. Okay, you've got to improve a little bit on your academics, but you know, you're getting there," and so forth. So it's fascinating how you have an evolution in some communities. Cultural communities. So what are your thoughts on how that plays out with your rollout of your toolkits?
Yeah, I absolutely think that you're correct, Chris. And we are seeing, and I think I said it in my introduction, an increase in parents that might not belong to any faith tradition, but they are choosing faith-based schools or values-based schools for their child's education, because it feels it supports the ethos that they're raising their children with. And I think that that cannot be undervalued. That's really, really important, that parents recognize that they're in alignment with that school community. So in terms of our tool, it's about encouraging people to analyze that and to reflect upon it. As Ilham has said, so often we do this unconsciously, and it's not until we bring these values to the surface and you look at them with your conscious mind and you reflect on how it plays out in your life that you can really create some really nice alignment with the parts of the community that you exist in. And I really believe that schools and careers, because they link so nicely, is a great place to bring that toolkit in.
Can I ask a negative question?
Of course.
And it's not because I have a challenge with anything you're doing. I think it's fantastic. We have activities in different parts of the world in our business, including Africa. And we deal with some of the diaspora populations that come to Melbourne. Often there is a disparity between the two parents in terms of power, influence, traditions. You know, this is what I say, hence this is what the family does. How does that reconcile with the great tool here, which certainly in my family, you know, the input from my wife, absolutely, you know, no issue at all. But in other cultures, that might cause a little bit of friction within the household. Is that something that you've seen, think about?
Ilham, did you want to discuss the cultural background?
So just to clarify the question, Chris, so what you're asking is how these values will pan out in households where there is different cultural perspectives, where there would be power imbalances and things like that. I'm getting that vibe from
Correct. You. And they've brought those imbalances from historical, from environments as new migrants from Africa, for example, where, you know, certain, in some cases, the female has very little power. And
I mean,
whereas in the West, it's you know, you can argue it's not the reverse, but certainly it's a lot more, there's a lot more parity.
Right. So let me just look at it in two parts. Firstly, I think you have an inherited dilemma, which you've got to acknowledge that when people come from different places, it becomes a melting pot, and each of us carry our own sets of values consciously and unconsciously, as we've seen. That's a given. Like, I don't think we can wind back and change that generation and change their thinking. But being optimistic, what I feel we can do with this set of values is by imparting these to the children through our schools. I think these children can take the message home. And when a child gives a message to a parent, even the most stoic, high-handed parent would crumble a little bit. I mean, it's far more effective coming from the child than from the spouse. And I think schools, from your previous comment about how do we impart these values, I think sitting on a board, the people who are in charge of governance have a big responsibility in setting the tone and the culture of the school. And these values can be made evident through artifacts around the school, which is what we used to do in my previous school where I was sat on the board. So we had the acronym MICE for Mutual Respect, Integrity, Compassion, and Excellence. So if ever there was a behavioral issue, we would ask the children to reflect and see which value did we transgress, which one did we not honor here. And those discussions surround around these values. So without going further and taking more time, I would say being multicultural and Australia having the demographics it has, I think rather than trying to change people's thinking and from their roots and from where they come from, we should try to change the current generation, because like I said in the poem that I closed with, life doesn't go back and tarry with yesterday. We've got to go forward. And I think empowering our children and changing their thinking. And my girls are very open-minded and very, sometimes very opinionated. And we have those issues at home because my husband and I come from fairly traditional upbringing, although I may not strictly conform to the traditional woman of Sri Lanka. But we grapple with this sometimes. And what I realize is we have to open our minds to hear them, because often the message isn't given in the tone or the voice that we like to entertain, but there is a message there. And it's about opening our minds, putting aside the tone and the voice and the behavior that comes with it, and trying to just hear the message. And that's where I would like to make the difference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kremen.
Yes, thank you, Ilham. And thanks for that question, Chris, which I really wanted to speak to. I thought it was an important one. And you'll be pleased to know that it's something that we thought about and anticipated as well with the development of the activity. So firstly, the activity is designed in a way that it can work with, I guess, any English-speaking person from any cultural background, really, because of the way it's designed. But it's also true that doing this kind of work is what I call brave work, because doing this kind of reflection on our values and how things are playing out in our lives, and where the values came from and where there are areas of conflict goes to our sensitive spots and places. And often this it can reveal that what lies at the root of, for example, unhappiness in a family or conflict with children is basically a conflict of deep values. So in the supporting materials, there's a podcast and other materials that we include, which provides more contextual information for people who are doing the exercise. We flag that this may be something that comes up for people. And a typical example could be a woman who has spent many years being a traditional homemaker and wife, but who in midlife feels that she needs to reclaim something of her own independence or her own economic independence. She might be in an abusive relationship, and so there can be a conflict of values again between my children are important to me or my faith tradition is important. However, my own authenticity or my own psychological well-being is also very important. So what we flag is that doing the activity can bring these kinds of things up, and that's an invitation for a conversation. And it may be an invitation for a conversation with your partner or other person, but it also may be an invitation for a conversation with a trusted friend or a specialist advisor, such as a psychologist or a counsellor.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rickard. Yes.
I just wanted to quickly jump in, Chris, because I think it's a great point to kind of bring up at the end, is that we cannot underestimate the importance of the collaboration between home and school. And if we could have this values activity as a resource in every school, that would be amazing to deliver on that. But we need to remember how families and schools help each other within the community. And I wanted to share an example that might resonate. So as part of my work, I was doing a project where I was reading annual reports from a school, and it was an Islamic school that had put in its annual report that it had identified that an issue in its community was parental expectation for academic outcomes. And they really wished that the report was this lovely story about how they really wished parents understood vocational education pathways. It just so happened that the Australian Parents Council had produced a series of infographics about vocational education, and we had converted into different languages. So we were able to send these infographics to this school and to say, here's a great resource from the parent perspective to really help you educate and work as a community and a whole community to support each other in the work that you do. And I don't think we can highlight that enough, is that it is about helping each other from the homeschool partnership perspective is the most important thing we can all do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Ramona Martinovici also posted in the chat room that all migrants coming to Australia have to sign the Australian values statement as well. And Ramona has done some work in the European Union also on the values side. Perhaps she'll be one of our forthcoming speakers. Now, I know we've hit the 5 o'clock, but are there any other questions? I do have a question to Dr. Joy De Leo. Can we take what fine work is being done here global?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I just want to start by congratulating the team, because I think this is a very innovative and powerful approach. And as they stated quite clearly, generally, career counselling takes an approach which is, what skills do you have? What are your preferences in terms of what do you like to do? And here are the jobs that are available, or the gaps in the workforce. Therefore, there are jobs available, and they try to do a match. And that's the approach that is usually taken. I don't know what approach is taken in other parts of the world, but it might be similar. So I think there's definite applications here, not only for parents, and I think that's really valuable and innovative, but also for career counsellors themselves, regardless of which country they're in, because there have been many research studies which show that school-based career counsellors have quite a focus on higher education and do tend to push that, as you said, Jenny, at the expense of vocational education and training, which has thousands of occupations related to that. And I dare say that might be the case in other parts of the world. The whole area of archetypes, that's very powerful because it operates at a subconscious level, and many of our values are subconscious. So I think that's a really interesting approach that you've taken. And yes, I do think, Chris, that there are applications to global education, definitely, because if many of those global values are linked to archetypes, and those archetypes have a very powerful impact on a person personally. And Ilham, you expressed that very clearly about the personal insights that you had from engaging with these values and archetypes. Then there's a transformative element in the use of this, and I see you nodding, Suzanne. There's a transformative element. And if we would like young people in the future to become leaders who promote peace and human rights, then it's not enough for them to know something from a cognitive, intellectual perspective. They need to know it very deeply in their values, in their heart, in their soul, and in that subconscious level. And you're, in a sense, bypassing the cognitive and going straight to the subconscious. And that's why it's so powerful. So Chris, thank you for providing the opportunity for me to comment, because I do think there are applications, and congratulations to all of you. I think it's a wonderful initiative, which I hope will reach career guidance counsellors as well. So thank you.
Thank you. John.
All right. Is it okay if I conclude with just a few remarks, Chris?
Yes, please.
Everyone, just so we can actually, we should wrap this up now. But can I ask, I do write a report about this, and I like to take a picture of the Zoom. Would you mind turning your cameras on and smiling? If you can. It's not, we won't, thank you. Some people are, yes, oh, good, you're risking that one. Oh, terrific. Thank you. So I'm just going to take a screenshot. I'm an IT teacher. I love screenshots. And if people can turn their cameras on, and then I'll just I'll give you a little report of what's going on and where this is all going. So let's try and do a couple of print screen here. Give me a second. All right, I'm going to do another one, and then I'm going to share. Okay. Let me do that. All right, terrific. Okay, so look, I just want to say we're going to conclude our value summits this year in October. So if you would like to recommend some speakers or recommend yourselves, we would be very grateful. This is an important work that we've done for 2 years, and we'll continue to do so. The second thing is I want to say that the values card exercise, I think, is extremely important, is my conclusion. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And the first is that parents themselves need to reflect about their own values. And, you know, it reminds me of a story that was shared on the ABC on Friday of a young Vietnamese man who is a very high-powered drug dealer in the 90s in Sydney. And he shared his story and he said, look, my father beat my mother, and I didn't know at the time, but it had a real impact on me. So what he said is, if you change the man, you change the wife and you change the kids, was his simple way of approaching it. But I think we can resonate with the point that we are at a, you know, that this is a critical work that values education actually in some way has to begin with the parents and not the children. How this is done, I think what you folks are doing is extremely important because it does that. It gets parents to reflect on their own values. Number two, it gets parents' involvement in the career choice of their children, which actually doesn't really happen. My experience is I think there's a big gap there in schools. I've been teaching in Australia for 22 years, and I think I speak with a bit of experience there. And three is that parents and children, as we've heard, will come closer together and to get to know each other's values. So as you can see, our passion, our goal is to promote values education. And what you folks have shared with us today is critical work in that way. So I like our concluding remarks from Jenny and said that we cannot underestimate the importance of cooperation between parents and the school. And I think that is an area that, quite frankly, there is work to be done. I don't know what you folks think about it, but in my experience, we're not there yet. We're really not there yet. But what you have done, I will certainly promote your project to heads of learning and heads of learning at my college and other places that I know. I think Chris and we can promote that, and others here. I think I'm looking forward to looking at your website in September and trying that activity myself. Thank you very much for presenting. Anyone, Chris, any final remarks? Anyone?
Thank you again from myself on behalf of everyone here. I'm a firm believer of next steps, and on this call we have representatives Leo from Asia Pacific, Ramona from the European Union. We've got connectivity through Africa as well as very good connectivity through the UPF and within Australia. So let's get on with it and change the community by implementing these great tools. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to our speakers. I think we've got a platform to move forward. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening, weekend, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.